All right, Pastor Brandon Washington is bringing the heat in a good way with a burning house right when we come back.
I've never seen that behind the scenes. I've never seen how that works. Okay, got it
Look,
now.
let me just say this: somebody made a bunch of money when COVID hit because like everybody was zooming. This thing called StreamYard come out, all that good stuff. So I wish I would have had some knowledge on that stock.
I see you.
That's another conversation. But grace and peace to you all. And I look who's back and look who we finally have on the channel. We got Apologist in Detroit, and we have Pastor Brandon Washington is here with us. How you doing, Pastor B?
I'm good. I'm good. I've been stalking the two of you for a couple years now, so this is a blessed time for me. It's just seeing you, there's a certain group of people who I pay attention to on YouTube, and you make the list, so it's good to be here.
Well, I feel some type of way about that. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Before we get into the fun stuff, just want to acknowledge the chat. Just want to acknowledge the folks as they come in. We got the New Testament theologist Nick Quint, Mr. Phil Fox, Mr. Green, Colin CMB, the ambassador. Shotty Mills is in the building. I need all of you guys to do me a favor because we have to make this thing worth it and live tonight. I need y'all to hit that like button and I need y'all to share this thing on all of your social media platforms that you have. So I would greatly appreciate that. But we also have Apologist in Detroit, and I did not want to do this interview without him. Because
man, I ain't got much of a voice. I got sick about a week ago, and I'm just getting over it. But I'm grateful to be here. If you're listening to me, I don't know whether I should be sorry for you or be appreciative of you admiring some of our work. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. Read your book. It was such a blessing to me. Spoke to my heart in many ways, some of which I shared in my review of the book. And I'm looking forward to this interview, asking a couple of questions and hearing you sharing a little bit more in person. Often you get a little more nuance when you're talking to a person than when you get a book that's like kind of edited to, tell it a story in a more concise way. So I'm happy to be here. Yeah.
Right.
Well, Pastor Washington, we're just gonna get right on into it. Like, I've been listening to you for quite some while. For quite some time, and I came across a session that you did on the Urban Perspective with Pastor Jerome Gay, and you really were approaching politics from a biblical place. I mean, you were talking about Marxism.
Yeah.
Okay, you were not endorsing it, right? So let's just go ahead and throw that out there. I know people. I don't care about the whole McCarthyism stuff where people like to just label folks so they can dismiss what they're saying. That's unchristian to do. Number one, it's anti-intellectual. You're trying to bypass what somebody's trying to say. But you were on there dropping bars, and I'm like, okay, who's this dude? And I found out you were from Texas.
So Dallas, Texas. Dallas to be precise. The Texas. Dallas.
There you go. I found out you were from Texas. Then I found that you were a kingdom agenda kind of guy. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so I was just intrigued. Of course, this book comes out, right? We kind of got hints of it, especially when I talked to you privately, that you were going to be locked away working on something. Usually people say that when they're like writing a book.
Right.
But but then this book came out, right? What prompted you? And I'm pretty sure you talked about it in the book, but really, what was the burden to bring about this book that you wrote?
That's a very good question. So in 2000, I graduated from seminary late because I started seminary in 2004, and as much as I enjoy learning, I hated seminary, and I couldn't figure out why. And and after a couple of years, I realized that it's because I was going through this process of doing theology in a culturalized way. And that was not even the primary problem. The primary problem was no one thought that's what we were doing. So you're obligated to embrace, to affirm a culturalized perspective of the faith. And anytime you raise questions that are relevant to your context, anytime you raise questions that would be a foregone conclusion in the part of the world you come from, that was dismissed as pushing against the faith. More than once, I was asked, "Why do we have to see you as a Black Christian? Why can't we just see you as a Christian?" And that question is motivated by the falsehood that the faith, the theology we were learning is not culturalized. When in fact it is. It was objectively, it was unashamedly European, Eurocentric in its norms. So that made seminary very difficult to me. So I left seminary for 8 years, 8 years, and had no plans on coming back. And I was challenged by a mentor of mine. In fact, I'm going to say his name because he passed away a year ago, and I want to always honor him. I was challenged by a mentor named Dr. Felix Gilbert, who had become the director of Denver Seminary's Urban Initiative. He came to me and said, "I want you to come back." He says, "I don't disagree with your concerns." He says, "I will address them from the top and you address them from the bottom, and we'll end up meeting in the middle," which is what we did over the next few years. And the when I came back, I realized that the seminary had experienced some revision, some changes, some shift in leadership and some shift in emphasis, and I was much more pleased with it. But the remnant of the concerns I had before I left were still there. And in addition to that, I had friends nationally who were having similar experiences in evangelical institutions, and they decided to leave even evangelical institutions, not sorry, pardon me, denominations, and they dropped the label. They stopped using the word. And I said, your theology hasn't changed, but you've dropped that word. So that resulted in me writing an article in 2019 in Christianity Today entitled "Black and Evangelical: Why I Keep the Label." And I got responses from two different groups, two different extremes. One of them were my white eternal siblings who took offense of my assessment of evangelicalism and its poor handling of history, and much of it ahistoricism, not even the ignoring of the past. They concede these moments occurred, but they denied their contemporary relevance. And then you have the other camp, which were men and women who look like me, and they're orthodox in their faith, but they'd walked away from evangelicalism. And I found myself in a position where they both took issue with how I assessed it, because one took issue with my evaluation of evangelicalism, and the other took issue with the fact that despite my assessment, I decided to maintain the label. And a very good friend of mine, a man who is an older brother, a man who has mentored me for 25 years, he challenged me on some with some really hard questions. That was Dr. Mason, Eric Mason, and I needed to be able to answer those questions well if I were going to have some measure of intellectual integrity in keeping this title, and keeping that word in as part of my identity. And the problem with that article in CT is you deal with the boundaries of space. So much was left on the editor's floor. So much was left there. And I realized that there was this need to expand it. And the two people who consistently challenged me on writing the book were Eric Mason and Jerome Gay. And they probably did not even, neither of them knew the other was doing it. Whenever I spoke to one or the other, I knew I was going to get it. So that's where this process came from. And then it came to a head, because I was fighting it hard, and it came to a head when Trayvon Martin was killed. And I said, I need to start this. And so the process of shopping the idea occurred then. And then the actual process of writing it occurred around the time when George Floyd was killed. And the reason those two moments are pivotal for me is I noticed the way my white evangelical friends responded to those two moments. And it didn't assess them from the same perspective that I assess them, some same concerns with the same hermeneutic that I have as a black evangelical. So I thought it necessary to ask, how did we get there where we have that wide a divide between us? Since our theology is the same, why is our orthopraxy, the way we live this out, why is it so different? And how can we turn that around and get closer to one another in how we evaluate these ideas and live them out in a fallen world?
I'm gonna let you go, Chris, but I just gotta ask a follow-up question. So you mean to tell me, right? And of course, you know what's coming. You mean to tell me this did not start with CRT, right? And George Floyd, and you mean are you kidding me? You
I had never heard of CRT until the first time I was accused of being a critical race theorist. Let me say this because I want to hear from Chris. Okay, let me say this, and we're going to move on. Okay, next month, Urban Apologetics Volume 2 comes out on June 20th. And Dr. Mason commissioned me to write the chapter in that book on critical race theory because he wants me to get emails, apparently. And I start that chapter off explaining I shared the moment, the first time someone accused me of being a critical race theorist. And I give my assessment of critical race theory. And I point out some of its weaknesses, significant weaknesses. It has no gospel. It's good at deconstruction, but it does not rebuild. It is not redemptive, which Christianity should be. However, critical race theory has, I would argue, a defensible historiography, a defensible historical method. And much of the reason they have that is they got it from not just Marxism, but from the civil rights movement and the Black church. And what's happening is because I landed in the same place, I landed at the same destination as critical race theory using the historiography that I inherited from the Black church and the civil rights movement, I'm automatically, the shared results, automatically identify me as a critical race theorist. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to correct it. Matt, that happened today. That happened this very day. Someone inboxed me on Facebook and said, I haven't read your book yet, but I bet you're woke and you seem to be a critical race theorist. And I said, back up before we get into to points 2 and 3 of your comment. Your first sentence was, I haven't read your book yet. So we're done. You're done. You have pigeonholed me, having never taken an opportunity, taken advantage of the place where I outline the ideas. Instead of checking for what the ideas are, you project them onto me. And we do that. This is a soapbox of mine. You started this. We do that because we have decided it's easier to resist someone's opposition if you can reduce an individual to a worldview and then reduce that worldview to its weakest characteristic. And that way it's easy to ignore you. But the fact is, history is resident in the present. And I don't care if it's a critical race theorist who says that, if it's a civil rights activist who says that, or if it's a Harvard-educated historian who says it. It's an objective fact. So to dismiss me because we come to the same conclusion is not genuine. It's an attempt to, it's a red herring. You're trying to change the subject so we don't have to deal with the hard stuff.
So that's about five different logical errors right there. One of the things that I didn't realize until listening to you today again, that nuance that the editing sometimes you miss out on, because I'm at a predominantly white church for the last 20 years, and then so I'm retrospectively thinking about those bookends before I ask my question. Those bookends of Trayvon Martin, which in my case there was like notable in retrospect, there was notable silence. Like I don't recall anything being said about it. Maybe my pastor, because my pastor is very much socially conscious. He's been socially conscious probably most of his adult life at the very least, particularly when it comes to race. But I would say even in that, our church operates sort of in a Presbyterian, even though we're not Presbyterian, we have ruling elders who are all have equal authority, and he's just the preaching elder. He's just an elder who's hired to do or who's responsible for doing the majority of the preaching. So he may have said something about it because he's socially conscious. I don't recall it if he did, but the murder of George Floyd was a catalyst for our community, which I'm not going to get into here today. But yeah, that was a significant event that kind of changed the trajectory of our church. That said, my question is, you talked about the domestic. You talked about how the gospel was domesticated. You used that illustration of the tree in your front yard, and then when you started to actually explain how you saw the gospel domesticated, you made some comments. Both regarding the ascension in Jesus' rule, as well as some other allusions to Jesus' kingship. I sensed a little Scott McKnight in there, and so like big fan of Scott McKnight here in the King Jesus Gospel. So yeah, talk a little bit about that. Why don't you share a little bit of how you perceive the gospel? Because I agree, I think the truncated gospel is a huge problem. You get the Dallas Statement on social justice, where they're kind of cleaving all type of stuff off of the gospel, and it's like, well, have you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Like, how do you get that the gospel is this when there's 4 gospels and they say a whole lot of these things that you're cleaving off? So why don't you share with us a little bit of where you sit currently with the gospel? How would you describe the gospel, and how would you kind of flesh out some of the often cleaved off parts of the gospels, and how that impacts some of the things you're writing about in the book?
Yeah, one of the reasons that's a particularly sensitive issue for me is I grew up in a dispensationalist world. So so much of my understanding of the gospel, it was birthed out of dispensationalism, and much of I tell people all the time I'm in recovery from those years of the dispensations. So I mention that to you because everything has to happen in phases, and they're very discrete. They're almost there's a hard stop in each dispensation, and consistently the way we handle the gospel is we have reduced it to the doctrine of justification. We tell people the gospel is Jesus died so I could have remission, forgiveness of my sin, and one day I get to inherit a golden streets and pearly gates. But let's not talk about golden streets and pearly gates right now. That's the next dispensation. We can have a argument over which millennial category you fall into, but that's irrelevant in the moment because that's not where we are right now. The responsibility we have right now is, this is how it's often taught, is to save people from a sinking ship. And then I was, when I was in seminary, this is when I came back, and I took New Testament with a brilliant man named Craig Blumberg, and the class was Gospels and Acts. And a part of that class, he required we read Scott McKnight's The King Jesus Gospel, and I was distracted from the assignment because I had to repent of my truncated understanding of the gospel while I was reading that book. In fact, one argument that he makes in that book is we're not evangelical, we're soterians. Our fixation is on the doctrine of justification, not a comprehensive gospel. We've reduced the whole message down to one of its parts, and we treat that part as though it is the whole. And so we're trying to get people saved from this ship before it goes down. But one thing I walked away from that book with is the gospel is not just mindful of the passengers on the ship, the gospel is mindful of the ship itself. That's a whole gospel. Jesus did not die merely so that we could experience eternal bliss one day. His agenda is that everything that is broken can be made whole because of what occurred on the cross. Now, one of the complications here is we stop at Easter. Our fixation is on the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. We stop at Easter. But the fact is, he ascended. He is present tense, not one day. He is present tense seated at the right hand of God the Father. And from that throne, he reigns now. And he wasn't subtle in the Great Commission. Everyone looks forward to sending missionaries out to Uganda and Ecuador, and they preach Matthew 28. But the primary agenda of Matthew 28 is not the sending of people, it's the declaration of his reign. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given unto me. So that is him publicly recognizing that God the Father has coordinated him. He's speaking as God-man there. So he has replaced Adam. Adam dropped the ball. We went without that earthly king. And Christ saying, I am present tense, the king. And we are the ambassadors, 2 Corinthians 5. We are the ambassadors of that kingdom, which means it's our responsibility to proliferate the culture, the values, the identity, the language of the kingdom. And what do we know is resident in his kingdom? Justice. What do we know is lacking in the world? Justice. So if it's lacking here, and we are officers, not just citizens, but officers of a higher kingdom, we are to bring the culture of that kingdom to bear here. You're not supposed to wait. We're the voices of it now. When he entered the temple, and I don't want to give the book away too much. I want people to actually read it. But when he entered the temple to declare the initiation of his ministry, he applied Isaiah 61 to himself. He says, I brought this wholeness. And he sat down and says, this passage has been fulfilled in your hearing today. He's present tense king. So our dismissiveness regarding the ascension has created a problem. We're waiting for a king, when in fact we already have one. And that has resulted in a truncation of the gospel. I would argue, and I'm unashamed in this, I would argue that it was necessary to truncate the gospel and deny the present reign, to deny the present kingdom, so that we could have some sinful desires we have in time. It's hard for you to say to a person who's enslaved, you're a citizen of a heavenly kingdom, and then continue to enslave them. It's hard for you to say to that enslaved person, I am the citizen of a heavenly kingdom. And because I'm a citizen, I'm supposed to look like the king and his kingdom, and then you enslave them, so that we could have these fallen world desires, this depraved need. We had to get rid of the present reign of the king. And I would argue that the truncation of the gospel was a deliberate act so that we could build a nation on the backs of stolen toil.
Preaching.
You set me up for that, though.
Oh, yeah, that was good, though. Hey, my pleasure. Go ahead, Matthew.
Well, I mean, we're not going to give the book away. We want y'all to go get it. We can have some book clubs if that's what y'all want to do. Go chapter.
That's what we need to do. We need, because I feel like often people buy books. Like, I'll be honest, even myself, I got plenty of books in my library that I haven't finished. I got plenty of books that I haven't even started, that I bought with the intention of reading it, and I was just my purchasing was outpacing my reading, and I never got back to them. I was interested, and then I lost interest and got interested in another book. This is the type of book that I feel like having a book club will facilitate people, because even if they don't read it, those people who do read it and the discussions that you'll have, if you're participating in it, will help you, will salt the oats, or, entice you to, engage a little bit more. And I think that's often how you get people to read a book like this. And, with all due respect, there's plenty of books. Like, I love reading. So like, it's a little easier for me to read a book because I love reading. So, I read a book last week, a whole book, Carmen Imes' new book last week, because I was on a launch team too. But I know that everybody not like that. A lot of people, it's a little harder for them to read. So yeah, book club. Let's set that up, Matthew. Let's do it. Yeah, we're going. Let's us host one. So at least we got one book club.
We're gonna do that. But in the book, go get it, y'all. I gotta talk about it because I got them on the channel. In the book, you just said that it was an intentional truncation of the gospel, especially when it's applied to other people. This is where we talk about the slave master's religion, right? And I think Frederick Douglass even made a distinction between the cultural Christianity of this land, and the Christianity of Christ. I think that Frederick Douglass was talking about the same thing we talked about the truncation of the pan-biblical message, but also, right, and you talking about the impact and the fruit of the gospel. How can the fall be greater in because what a lot of people are telling us when there's a fixation, as you would say, on justification, what it does is it makes the fall greater in power and impact than the solution. I mean, could you speak to that a little bit? Right. I mean, you talked about the fruit of the gospel, but could you just talk to the fruits of the gospel and the process of how the gospel was domesticated here in America?
Yeah. I think one of the things we need to consider here is it is easy for you, and this is not a way of setting up some measure of clemency. This is just I'm just trying to address perspective here. It is easy to see the gospel as small when you don't need for it to be big. So if you are the privileged group and you're not on a daily basis wrestling with second class citizenship and even and living a life where you're categorized as property, and children, you're a grown man, and children can refer to you as boy and treat you as other and treat you as lesser, and you look at the accomplishments of people with whom you interact regularly. You see the accomplishments of them around you, and there's never hope for you. You would need a big gospel. I would maintain that evangelicalism exists to the degree that it does in America because of the marginalized. And the single largest marginalized people groups were the people who are on the lower end of the hierarchy, the racial hierarchy, the lower end of the human caste system. And the reason they lean so heavily into a big gospel is because they desperately need it for it to be big. In addition to that, you need the gospel to be small and to some degree irrelevant presently if you are the one benefiting from that caste system. You have to give the people in the caste system the understanding one day God will deliver you, but not today. One day you'll be my peer, but not today. And you do that because you desire to benefit from them being a racialized inferior. That's why we had to do that. So the idea of removing justice from the gospel is a selectively deliberate act. Now, I want to make this very clear. Selective is important here because anytime Christianity overlaps with conservatism, we don't do it. So in regards to the same people who will get up in a pulpit and say, we should not get into discussions regarding the ethnic rift. We should not be voices of advocacy regarding social justice. And we need to take a stand against the racial voices in the category of wokeness. The same people who make that argument, they will preach a whole sermon on abortion. I will make this very clear. They are not wrong to preach against abortion. But my question is, by what authority do you confront one and not the other? The doctrine of the Imago Dei is the reason I stand as an advocate for the unborn. There is no expiration date on the image of God. So the 24-year-old man who's jogging through a neighborhood in Georgia is just as valuable in the eyes of my God as the prenatal child. So when that man is shot in the middle of the street, the same voice that speaks up against abortion should apply to the aborted 24-year-old man. It's a selectively orphaned marker of our faith. We will concede that activism is a part of our evangelical identity, but we do it selectively. We'll take a stand regarding marriage. There were people who took a stand regarding masks during an epidemic, a pandemic. They took a stand against masks because they considered that a matter of justice, and they would remain silent. Now, I want to touch on something you said earlier. I think it was Apologist in Detroit who said this. Some of my friends who have never said a word and Matt, you can appreciate this because you and I have discussed this a little bit behind the scenes, who have never said a word regarding racialized injustice. They've never said a word about the racial rift. Never, never. They've now published books confronting CRT and wokeness. And I would say you're disqualified. You're disqualified. And I would say it to your face. You're disqualified. You remained on the sidelines, silent. You were a mute. You sat idle for decades. And then one day, when the worldview that you valued was encroached upon by discussions regarding justice, then you became an expert and you started to assess the weary soldiers who have been on the battlefield on this issue for decades, and you dismissed their concerns. The fact that they know more about it became irrelevant because you have a grasp around a notion, a framework, and a set of ideas. You became the authority on it, and you wrote a book so that you could take advantage of the fact that this is the hot debated issue in the country, and it will affect sales. And that is disheartening to me. It's the reason I could not be idle.
That's
And
immoral. It's outright immoral. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. You're like you now you setting up my milk crate because like one of the things that I've come to appreciate. I picked up the habit of reading through the Bible every year about 10 years ago or so, and one of the things I've learned to appreciate is understanding the Old Testament. From my introduction as a Christian and becoming a Christian, I was told the Old Testament is done away with and we're Christians. And then I was given a tradition of New Testament theology that I never questioned. I just, was along for the ride and took for granted that those who were preaching to me throughout the first decade or so of my Christian existence knew what they were talking about. They were the experts, and I was sitting at their feet learning. But from this habit of reading through the scriptures, I started to realize like a lot of the indictments of Israel were regarding social issues, social issues of oppression against marginalized people. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. That's okay. How is that significant theme in the Old Testament? A theme that they're actually going into exile for, and that Yahweh's making this big deal about, let alone when you get back to Torah and you see, Yahweh talking in Deuteronomy 8, hey, don't get the big head. I'm the one to give you the power to get wealth. Don't get this calloused heart when you get in these nice houses and eating this good food and start thinking that you did this on your own. And, Deuteronomy in particular is a book that I think concisely puts a lot of these ideas into place. It's the third most quoted book of the Old Testament. In the New Testament is Deuteronomy, sort of a hint. But let me kind of turn this into a question so that we can turn it back over to you. But yeah, this was that was life-changing for me, kind of grasping the Old Testament, and that made more sense of the New Testament when Jesus is in Matthew 25 saying, when I was hungry, when I was naked, when James is another book that's written to Jews like Matthew is saying, like, how can you say that you believe when you don't do these things that to us might seem abstract or marginal in the sense of the way the gospel was presented to us initially within the tradition, if we don't realize these are appealing to the ethics of the Old Testament. These are appealing to Torah ethics. Right. And these aren't abstract ideas. These are ideas fundamentally built into Yahweh's ethics system. And that's why James is making a big deal about it. That's why John in 1 John, that's why Messiah, Jesus himself, is making a big deal about these things. And for us, because we've been given this soterion, truncated gospel, we're afraid that we're tainting the gospel when we're talking about these things, when, again, Matthew 25, that's in the gospel. So kind of turning that into a question. You had one of the things that stood out to me was you talked about the a little bit, I think, in the introduction. I know Mason did as well. How Mason talks about the products of our environment. You talked about it in a more expand way, both in the introduction and the early parts of the book with the history of race and such. So, and to me, that stood out to me in the second part of the book too, how this is kind of interdisciplinary. And I guess that's where I want to go with my question. With the interdisciplinary, I think that's one of the barriers to people seeing it, because it's one thing for us to talk about the theology. It's another thing for us to talk about the history. And it's a whole another thing for us to recognize the sociological implications of these things. How does this, how did you get to the point where the picture started to kind of make sense for you? Because it seems like it's a very vast and complex issue that we're kind of dealing with here, or at least in a sense of properly diagnosing it so that we can start to see these things more clearly. So how did you kind of get there? And then what are some ways one of the ways I would say is read this book, but what are some things that you would advocate for, that you would share, and as far as kind of coming to grips with that, and then addressing that vast interdisciplinary nature of this issue?
Yeah, okay. So I need to back up, because that's a very good question. So I want to back up and touch on something you said, and then come over into the answer as brief as I can. I had a very similar experience to you regarding. I was a New Testament guy. To this day, Greek is my strength. Hebrew is not. And it's because I endured Hebrew. I loved Greek. I'm not ashamed to say this. So I either would audit a Hebrew class to keep it from affecting my GPA, or I was go ahead and take a B or a C. I never made less than a 95, an A in Greek. That was because I was a New Testament guy. The person who turned that around for me was a man named Danny Carroll. Danny Carroll was an Old Testament professor at Denver Seminary, and he is now a professor at Wheaton. In fact, he wrote an endorsement. He wrote an endorsement for A Burning House, and I had him for the second semester of Old Testament, and he would often complain. I could see what he was talking about, because if you take the New Testament surveys for 2 semesters and the Old Testament surveys for 2 semesters, the New Testament has 2 semesters to cover 33% of the Bible. I have to cover the other 66% in the same amount of time. And because of that, you could tell that he had to selectively choose where he's going to dig in. And he's a scholar on the book of Amos. And I remember the day he said, the point of the book of Amos is social justice. He says, that's the reason it exists. I said, now you got to realize that's not a very long, that's Minor Prophets. That's not a very long book. And I guarantee you, when we get into the heavenly kingdom, when we get to eternity, Amos is going to walk around and do a survey. Who read my book? And he said, it wasn't that long. You could have done it in an hour or 2. It wasn't even that long. And I guarantee you, it's an unattended book. The whole agenda of it is social justice. And the idea that a book is dedicated just to that. And then when we start unpacking the passages, and he started diving into it, and he does that so natural. It's like reading the newspaper for him. You walk away thinking you just read this contemporary novel when he's done. And I had a conversation with him in which I said, I have to repent of my leaning toward the New Testament. I have to repent of that. And I said, I was always looking for the words of Christ. And he says, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, he's quoting.
You got muted. Your microphone went out.
I think it got good to you and you muted yourself. Hold on.
Yeah, we still don't hear you.
It's still muted.
Check your settings.
Make sure you click the unmute button.
It doesn't show that he's muted, so I don't think he's muted.
Okay.
I think that it's got something to do. He might have to go into his settings. He might have to go out and come back in, because it doesn't show that he's muted on the screen.
Okay,
and he's
right.
in. So try going out and then coming right back in, and we'll talk into that. Okay, because I'm about to talk on Amos till he get back. Because I recently read Amos, and one of the things that stood out to me is 3 different times Amos is critiquing rich people, for how they view wealth. And do you want to say something? See if your microphone's back. Not yet. It's not back yet. Okay. Yeah. So and then I think 6 or 7 different times he specifically mentions the poor, in the book of Amos. And so, I immediately thought, because of our recent context, they call Amos like a CRTist or intersectionality guy, because he's talking about the oppressed. He's talking about rich people. He's talking about poor people. Go ahead and say something whenever you're ready to jump in. I'm just filling time. But you unmute yourself now. Now you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you crystal clear now.
Lord.
You crystal clear now. I knew it was just the settings. Yeah. But yeah, it was I was like they'll call Amos an intersectionality guy, because he's like, y'all in these big houses, living this good life and looking down and exploiting these poor people. And I'm like,
that's not like Marxism.
Amos ain't no joke.
So Dr. Carroll drove that into my head, though, that he's the idea of, I call this passage the empathy imperative, to love your neighbor as yourself. That's a quote from the New Testament. Jesus is a member of the Godhead that drives that Old Testament reading of it. But the incarnate Christ quotes it for us, so that it's not a dead ethical imperative. I think that we often dismiss that much more quickly. I don't think we should dismiss it at all, and we tend to dismiss it very quickly. And so one of the struggles I have with that is whenever someone tells me, but we're the New Testament church and those matters do not apply. Well, I can give these to you from the New Testament. In addition to that, the Jesus whom you claim, he's also citing Old Testament text. Paul said in Romans 13 that he quoted, love your neighbor as yourself. They're appealing to the Old Testament imperative. The bigger thing here that I struggle with, and I kind of lost track of your question because of the microphone gate, but the bigger thing I want to drive home here is we will find whatever way we can to limit the obligation to be a communal, sacrificial, selfless body of believers. We're dealing with the hyper-Westernization, the radical Westernization of our faith. And we lean into individualism, and we tell people ridiculous things that no one has ever done, like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. When in fact, my king said, when you fed, you were feeding me. When you quenched, that was my thirst. When you clothed, you were covering me. When you visited, you were coming to see me. He identified with the least of these.
Wait a minute. That sounds like Cone.
Well, it's maybe Cone. Here's the problem I had with how we handle theology.
I'm sorry for cutting you off. I had
no. Here's my problem with it. We will assume that because, and again, we talked about this the other day, Matt. I learned in seminary that the Western view of the Trinity that I had, I won't call it heretical, but I would call it incomplete. I would call it sound adjacent. I wouldn't call it rock solid. And we think that because a person is imperfect in one area, you have to dismiss the whole framework. And are there areas where I disagree with Cone? Yes. But I think much of what Cone is doing there is he's applying an African-American theological method that was inherited from the African cultural identity. It's a communal faith. So whenever one of the biggest mistakes we make when it comes to history, for example, is we'll tell people to get over the past, but that's in direct violation to an African theological method. It often takes the form of a heretical practice. Whenever we talk about being linked to the ancestors, I would call that a heretical practice, but it's a cultural value. To tell someone to disconnect from their past is asking them to cease to be themselves. And I would argue that being mindful of the past and its relevance to the present, it's a Christian idea. It's a Christian thing to do. It's a biblical thing to do. So for us to dismiss our communal responsibility to be selfless, to function as a body, to look to the Trinity as our model of community, that's the biblical idea. And instead of doing that, we redefine the Trinity and treated them as three individuals who happen to hang out with one another. And because of that, we can just do that. And we can dismiss the communal and social responsibilities that comes with having a harmonious and social Trinity.
Three individuals who hang out with each other.
That's how we treat the Trinity. That's why when we get into a discussion regarding the Trinity, it's always about
the Father is God, the Spirit is God, the Son is God, and then became incarnate, who is now God and man. But we never get around to having a conversation regarding the eternal relationship that exists among the three of them. The God whom we serve is superior to the God of Islam, because there has never been a time when God the Father did not love someone. There has never been a time when God the Father did not enjoy the fellowship, the community of someone. In fact, that we almost got this right, because even Jonathan Edwards, and if you read the book, you find out I have some issues with Jonathan Edwards, but even Jonathan Edwards and St. Augustine, they pointed out the deep intimacy between the Father and the Son. In fact, I think it was Edwards who identified the intimacy between them. He says that link between the Father and the Son, that's the Spirit. There has never been a time when the Father did not exist in a perfect, harmonious society of, when God did not exist, in a perfect, harmonious society of three. And that is our model. So for us to look at that and treat them as individuals, because we're projecting our individualistic values onto God, it's a disservice to him. It's a disservice to his expectations of society, and it leads to the unethical behavior, the mistreatment and injustice that we project onto others in human societies.
Woo!
Chris is too much. So I mean, you just touched on something, right? So there in Western theology, and some people might listen to this and take issue that I even said Western theology.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that you helped me to realize is that nobody does theology in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Nobody. If you think you're doing theology in a vacuum, that is a major blind spot, and we just got to help you understand that nobody does theology in a vacuum. With that being said, the quote unquote Western style theology would have us to emphasize the epistemological implications of good theology to the detriment of its ethical outworking, its ethical applications. And so one of the things that I told you this, I really appreciated with the Trinity was the fact that you brought it to bear on how we relate toward one another. Mm-hmm. And of course, certain apologetic methods would tell you that if a worldview is not livable, along with it not contradicting itself, along with it also being true according to the facts of experience, but even if it's not livable, there's a red flag.
Okay. Let me do this, and I'm gonna make this one shorter. I'm talking too much. Okay. So I would argue that a credible worldview has to be existentially viable. That's Urban Apologetics Volume 1. Go back and read that one. Okay, I actually addressed that. That's one of the qualifiers I will put. It has to be something that can be lived in the real world. Here's the problem. It is possible for something to be livable for you, but oppressive for someone else. And you can miss that in the West because we're so siloed. Individualism is a value instead of integration, that you will not see how unlivable this idea is for someone else because you cast them off as other. And when they complain about it, you can ignore them because aliens are easier to ignore. So we have to integrate this thing so that you can get a better perspective on what is livable. So what when I was coming out of school, I had a friend who wrote his master's thesis on the Christian virtues of a free market system. He wrote a thesis on the Christian worth of capitalism, which I find amazing. And I said, well, how far back are you going? How far back are you going to go? Because much of the capitalism you're discussing was built on the backs of enslaved people. And that you cannot reproduce that now. So it may not work as well today as it would have worked a century or two ago. I said the thing that you were experiencing, the thing you value, the thing you identify, was not available to people of color. And people of color was wider. If you read the introduction, I go into this. People of color at the time was wider group of people than it is now. Italians were people of color. Jews were people of color. The Irish were non-white. They were in that. They were not black. They were in the gap between the two extremes between the top and the bottom. But those things were not available. Women were not in this camp. You had to be a wealthy, land-owning male for these things to be available to you. And if you're not mindful of the fact that you are benefiting from something that's not available to everyone, then this thing that you see as a God-honoring thing could in fact be dishonoring for a whole mass of people who are on the downside of this. You have to integrate our body so you can see the world from the perspective of someone else. The problem I have with this is everyone universalizes their experience. Everyone is saying, I haven't seen what you're saying. Well, of course you haven't. When was the last time you were? Man, I'm from Pleasant Grove. I'm from Southeast Dallas. I'm from the part of Dallas where there were Bloods in my neighborhood, and I remember the launch of the crack epidemic. It wasn't like it is now where we actually look at the opioid epidemic and try to figure out what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at people who were victims of the crack epidemic, and we saw them as criminals who needed to be arrested because of the devastation they're bringing on the community. And by the way, it wasn't just white people who thought that. There were black people who took that position in the neighborhood where I came from. You fast forward 30 years, and you have an opioid epidemic. And because you identify with the victims of the opioid epidemic, your question is not, what do we do with them? It's what can we do for them? You can see the circumstances from their perspective. I wonder if we had a godly integration, a more communal perspective on the world, if there would have been a different response to the crack epidemic. But because you see people who are enduring it as other, what is good for you must be good for them, and you don't evaluate it to see whether or not that's true. That's the brokenness of our system.
And you like even the way you just explained it, they get communal values because with the opioid epidemic, they're responding to others, not themselves. The others are just people that they relate to, as you pointed out, versus the people that they don't relate to, which goes to your earlier comment about alienation.
Yes.
You know, it's the alienation that leads to them. And this is again, if you go back and read Torah, it's the same concept of what's going on. These aliens are coming into Israel, probably largely due to commerce, because this is the ancient world. And while they're there, they get to observe the priestly people of God living, practicing their festivals, and seeing things like Jubilee taking place.
Yeah.
And there's a prescription. If they become circumcised, they can participate in Passover. Implication, they can participate in all these covenantal blessings. If they want to join God's covenantal community of people. But that's not how Christians today often operate. You know, we think that our homogenized perspective of Christianity is what people needs to come and participate in, and often that because of the historical reasons that you point out in the book, these social issues are marginalized. These social issues we don't find an appropriate home for them. They're virtuous things that maybe we should potentially do something about or could do something about. There's no obligation. Whereas in Christianity, according to Jesus in Matthew 25, there's an obligation. According to James in James 2, there's an obligation. You know, so that kind of a the message or the observation and kind of drawing that out is so valuable. It's so important. It's one of the things that I think that your book, again, you know, kind of putting a narration to this massive problem that exists today, to where you can begin to, it begins to have some cohesion, and you can begin to see it a little bit more clearly versus, just seeing the different parts of it and them not making sense individually.
Have you ever noticed that So there's we will outright deny the culturalization of our faith. But there's all this evidence of it. So if you go to Africa right now and you encounter several pastors there or African missionaries and continental Africans who are missionaries, Christians who are there, you will notice that when you walk into their centers of worship, they're singing Western songs in their centers of worship. And they are wearing slacks and short sleeve button up shirts. And they're doing that because they dress like the missionaries who led someone in their spiritual genealogy to Christ. So when they took when Westerners took their faith to Africa, especially in the 20th century, they didn't just take Jesus is Lord with them. They took, and this is how you dress if Jesus is Lord. And this is how you sing. The idea of going there and affirming their indigenous garb as an expression of an image bearer and saying and introducing Christ to them while they still wear their garb and maintaining their musical or worshipful style while introducing them to Christ. Lost idea. It's a lost idea. So whenever someone denies that we are studying a culturalized Christianity, I will remind them that Africans adopted Western or Eurocentric, Euro-American cultural values, including the way they dress, because missionaries told them, this is who your king is, and this is how he wants you to dress. And coincidentally, the way he wants you to dress is just like me. Gray slacks, short sleeve button-up shirt, and a tie. That's not fly. That's not fly. That is not them dressing to impress. They all look like the missionaries who came to get them, who had no style. Again, Selah.
He dropped a Selah on us. To Chris's point, and we want to be respectful of your time, Pastor B.
Okay.
So there's a little back chat that you can use, say when we got to wrap this up.
Okay.
The book is interdisciplinary, right?
Yes.
And so you talked a lot about history. You laid out. It was almost like you were cutting off the rebuttals to this book, before people even made them. Yeah, I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
So you laid out your historical method, and you also talked about the role that experience plays. So to lead to my question, oftentimes, the language that you used in this book, it was strategic. I don't want to give away your playbook, but words like supremacy ideology, systemic brokenness. I'm stealing all of that. I'm not stealing it. I'm gonna borrow it from you.
Sure.
But you talked about the role that experience plays in allowing people to see something that has been there the whole time. It's not a presupposition. It's something that has been there, that experience serves as an epistemic, as a powerful epistemic factor in forming one's forming one's knowledge of a certain thing. Could you just talk about that? Because a lot of times when I've heard people say things like, if a person is mentioning something as systemic racism, that's a presupposition. And look, I like presuppositional apologetics. I mean, we could debate about it a little bit, but to call it a presupposition, what they're almost trying to insinuate is somehow I'm crazy.
Ooh. Okay, so I wrote this book for two people. I'm gonna. There's a couple things that come out of that question. I wrote this book for two groups of people, and in fact, I have an individual who is representatives of those two groups. I wrote it for people who would be in what we would typically call, well, not typically, this is kind of new, the evangelical crowd. The people who were evangelical, they're not necessarily leaving the faith. They're maintaining orthodoxy. but they are dropping the label. They're dismissing the language of the brand of evangelical. And then I also am writing to people who are taking offense to the critique of evangelicalism. And one of my goals is to say to both of them, the people who say they observe these things, they are not crazy. That's one of my goals. I want for people who are dismissive to hear me say, those who see this are not crazy. I want for people who are observing it to hear me say, you are not crazy. You are not alone in the observation that you're making. Now, one of the reasons it had to be interdisciplinary is I've noticed the carelessness with which we bring to this discussion. So allow me to be this person for just a moment. So I went to in seminary, I studied systematic theology and apologetics and ethics. And so I don't have 2 degrees, but I have one master's degree, and I was a double major. And one of my takeaways, I had a professor who pounded this in my head. He says, you cannot be a good theologian unless you are first a good historian. I would argue that's true of everything. You cannot be a good physician unless you understand the history of what you're doing. You cannot be a good scientist unless you know the history of it. You know the history and the philosophy of whatever it is you're doing. And I notice it is my predisposition to bring the historical runway to any theological discussion that I participate in. So that is the approach I took with this book. The other reason I had to do that is, and that's why one chapter is just dedicated not just to history, but to some exposition of text, is I've noticed, Chris, I know apologist is in your name, okay? But allow me to be critical of my apologetics friends.
Hey, you preaching to the choir.
Okay? They do not default to what the Bible says on something. Okay. In fact, many times, and this is addressed in the chapter Reason Over Theology. I'm a fan of philosophy. I wrote a chapter in Urban Apologetics defending and explaining philosophy's worth. I'm a fan, but it has to always be in the supplemental position. Philosophy is the handmaid. Theology is the queen. You have to start with a good theological base. If you don't start with revelation, a philosopher's responsibility is to organize revelation. If you don't have a good revelation, you have good insight, then your organization, your structure is going to be flawed. And a lot of my friends who are apologists, they don't start with what God has said on the matter. They start with their philosophically originated worldview. And then they reverse engineer it back to the Bible. They have the presupposition in place, and then they will project that idea onto Scripture. So I want to be sure that we had a good theological base, and that we had a good biblical base, and that we had that set the standard for what we mean when we say philosophy, and that we do some exposition and we do some consideration of the history of where we are. We had to do that very carefully. It had to be an interdisciplinary approach. Otherwise, it would have fallen apart. Now, I would argue that what we're dealing with here is it's a matter of theological ethics. I have completely lost track of your question because I talk so much. But I think what we're dealing with here is an issue of theological ethics, and everyone is turning a discussion that should be a matter of theological ethics. We're turning it into a discussion regarding politics. And politics can never be your starting point. Your political perspective should be the product of your theology, not the other way around. So much of the conflict is occurring because the church decided to assume its influence, to reassert its influence in the world by picking parties, by taking partisan stands, by associating with political tribes, instead of applying the power bestowed upon us on the day of the Great Commission by the King who can commission. Because we have not done that, we've fallen short of the mission to which God has called us. We are off mission because we're trying to control where the world is going based on how we vote. But the Bible does not say, go and make politically minded converts. It says, go and make disciples. And the problem with the go and make disciples thing is it's longer, it's harder, it's more taxing. I had a conversation with a friend today in which we were discussing this. He says, you'll notice that in American Christianity, the image went from being a farmer to being a warrior. And if you're a warrior, you have to always be at war with someone. And you're never getting around to the responsibility of cultivating the land. And if you're a warrior, you will look at the land's disrepair and you'll blame the land. But God made us to be farmers. So if the land is in disrepair, that's our fault. Much of what we're observing, everyone will come to me and talk about, but the world is, we're dealing with men assuming confusion regarding their gender, and we're amening that in classrooms, and it's all these complexities. And my question is, well, you're trying to legislate against that when the entire time we were abdicating the responsibility to be the cultivators of the land and to set culture. Instead of trying to invest into them as disciples, we try to legislate their behavior. Behavior modification is not disciple making. We're supposed to make an impact culturally in a fallen world so that God can be made famous. His culture and values, his kingdom can be put on display. And because it didn't go the way we wanted, because we did not fulfill that commissioning, we're not trying to make new laws instead of going back to the thing we were told to do in the first place. I'm contending that we need to return to the love we had at first and fulfill the commissioning that our first love gave us. And instead of legislating everything, let's be proximate with those who are falling away from him and invest into them the kingdom message, values, and culture that reflect his holiness and his virtue.
Ooh, you preaching. Matthew, was you about to jump in? I got some comments.
Okay. I just have one thing because
you go first.
He's touching. I see you in the middle of it, Pastor B. He's touching on something that he wrote in the book, Identity and Affiliation. And you talked about how the identity, before I talk about what you said, right? I think that Christians in America are having an identity crisis.
Absolutely.
Okay. The issues that we have, the reason why you get some Christians that get so offended.
Yeah.
If you have anything to say about the founding fathers, or even quote unquote Confederates who claim to be Christians, they'll lose their mind behind Confederates. It's because of a retardation in how we form our identity.
Yeah.
And so in the book, please go get the book. You talk about how the disciples' identity in Christ determines the ethical trajectory of their life,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And you just pointed out that Jesus is the same God of the Old Testament, right? And the goal, the work of the Holy Spirit is to ultimately transformation, right? Of us into the imago Christi. Talk about that a little bit.
Matt graduated the other day, y'all. Matt just graduated, so I can't pay all this money for these words and not using them. Matt just like, listen, I got a master's degrees too, but I got. Here's my quick answer to that question. Okay, when national values devolve to becoming an idol, you will make God conform to the national values. If ever God and national values are in conflict, God will lose. But you don't want to be without him. So what you do is you turn him into a co-signer of the national values, which means instead of us pursuing the image of Christ, for those of you who don't have Matt's master's degree, okay, for those of you who don't, instead of us conforming to the image of Christ, we conform Christ to our image. And not too long ago, this one I realized the complexities of this. Not too long ago, I had a very complicated conversation with with someone who was upset with the church that I pastor. And I should have known I was in trouble because they came with a list, a handwritten list. And one of the things on the list was, in all the time I've been here, we've never, on a Sunday morning, we've never sung God Bless America. I said, well, the star of that song is America. The fact that God gets a throwaway reference in the song does not make it theocentric. The star of that song is America. Do I want God to bless America? Yes, but I'm not going to make America the center of a worship gathering. We are conforming God to our national identity. And because we're doing that, we think that everything that is American gets the blessed cosign. It gets a stamp of approval from God. And the idea of that is the reason we made it to the late 20th century with a whole group of second-class citizens in the country. While God is saying they're made in the image of God. They're made in my image, and because of that, they have innate dignity, they have innate worth. We as a nation were saying, God, we're first. And we're going to cite passages that defend it. I have commentaries in my library that appeal to the curse of Ham to argue for my second-class citizenship. I have commentaries in my library that argue that the Canaanites could not be dark-skinned, and it's based primarily on the accomplishments of the kingdom. The fact that God identifies Cush as, not the Canaanites, I'm sorry, the Cushites. The fact that God identifies Cush as a mighty empire from the south, which is evidence of the fact that when he comes back, he's going to be bringing people from all four directions, and is evidence of that he chose a mighty nation from north, south, east, and west. The southern nation he chose was Cush. And I have a commentary in my library that was published in the 1990s that argued that they were probably brown-skinned, but definitely not dark-skinned. And the context of that is to use Jerome Gay's language, is to whitewash our Christian faith. We are nationalizing our faith, which is forcing God to conform to who we are instead of us conforming to his image. And when you do that, inevitably, you're going to be off mission, and theological ethics will go out the window.
Ooh. You said so much that I wanted to kind of chime in on. First thing that popped in my head when you were talking about the apologetics is like, I've been disenchanted with, classic apologetics as practiced here in America for probably about 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And I got into apologetics before I got into theology proper. And so I got stuck with the name. It's pithy, it's catchy. And so I just stuck with it, even though I'm not very much of an apologist in the classical sense anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Shh, don't tell anybody though. That said, it made me think of, I remember when I read Francis Schaeffer's How Then Shall We Live? Mm-hmm. And so for a while I was putting Renaissance art on my as my big picture at the top. And I put Peter Paul Rubens' Triumph of the Eucharist, where you have philosophy and the handmaidens of theology. So anyway, it made me think of that when you were talking a little bit earlier. And if you've ever been to Italy, like Italy, that's a crazy place. One, yeah. Two, there's a whole lot of like famous people like Galileo and Leonardo, and these people are literally buried inside of churches. I've been inside of a church where almost the entire floor is filled with dead aristocrat Christians who for at their time, men of their time, thought that this was a significant way to, practice Christianity. They're literally buried inside of the church. Hundreds of people buried inside of church. And it's filled with Renaissance art too. That's a whole nother conversation right there. Mm-hmm. Something that you were talking about when you talking about the politics part of it earlier, which kind of came to mind. I forget what's the Greek word for apostasy, but the meaning of it if memory serves me correct, it's like if you're working against your king. That's where the concept of the word comes from in its original Greek context. It's like, okay, you are obligated, or you've pledged your allegiance to this king, but you're secretly working with someone else to undermine him and to underthrow him, and you're an apostate.
Yeah.
That's where this concept comes from. And when you were talking about the whole abdicating our duty by casting a vote, or hitching our cart to a political party, both liberal or conservative, and assuming that these parties are going to accomplish, to me, that's apostasy. It, particularly when you start to recognize the King Jesus gospel.
Yes.
He's a king. He's a political figure. As a matter of fact, Isaiah says the government will be on his shoulders. He will bring righteousness and justice to the nations. He's literally spoken of and prophesied as a political figure. That's what Messiah, anointed one, that's just referring to. It's right there in front of our faces. But because our truncated gospel, because our often truncated theology in general, kind of dismisses or marginalizes this notion of Jesus, this political reality of the political emphasis of Jesus, who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing. Also related to that ascending and ruling part that you mentioned in the book. We often, miss the mark, and we think that this political allegiance in our present time is the way. When from Genesis to Revelation, if you pay attention to the narrative, Yahweh, Jesus, in the New Testament are advancing a culturally subversive religion. In other words, instead of coming and just taking over, the command is to live in a way that our Lord, our King, Yahweh or Jesus, has prescribed for us. And by virtue of us living out these values, these ways of loving our neighbors as ourselves, those who are living under the rule of these evil, oppressive kings and kingdoms of this world, they will see the virtue, the righteousness. They will see the beauty, the blessedness of Yahweh's way, of Jesus' way of life. And through subversion, they will come over and join and elect Jesus as their king, their political leader. So yeah, I think that seeing
the thesis of Jeremiah 29. Everyone quotes Jeremiah 29:11,
right?
But you got to read the whole chapter. You just gave the thesis of Jeremiah 29.
Exactly. I often joke and say, hey, they never go down to 18 to 19 and claim them curses either. They only claim it.
Why are you being cursed? Seek the welfare of the city, build houses, and give your children in marriage, and,
exactly,
and build barns and set up crops. While you're experiencing the hardship, subversively in the city.
Exactly. And guess what? That's exactly what Daniel did. And guess what happened with Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar humbled himself and said, we all got to pay homage to the God of Daniel. Guess what Darius the Mede said? He said, is any God greater than the God of Daniel? Everybody needs to worship the God of Daniel. So, we miss this, how the subversion, and Daniel becomes this significant second temple character that everyone wants to talk about and everyone wants to utilize in their theology in order to advance their theology. They're referencing Daniel. So yeah, I think that because we struggle, because our theology is very truncated. Our theology is very truncated, and it's based on the New Testament that often marginalizes or is just completely almost dismissive of the Old Testament. We get to this point to where we have this domesticated gospel. We have this marginalized New Testament theology that doesn't know what to do with works, doesn't know what to do with social justice, and these things become an infringement, the Dallas Statement of Social Gospel, upon the thing that we think is most important, atonement. Anyway, again, I love this book. I love this book because, again, this book synthesized a very significant topic for me as a person who goes to a predominantly white church and who has been tasked with the responsibility of graciously given the privilege also, in the sense of helping my own community to understand this. There's never been a single work. It's always been, read Divided by Faith. It's always been read The Color of Compromise, read 10 books. And over the course of these 10 books, you get a little from here, a little from there. Some of these books aren't even Christian books. It's a book on the Great Migration, or it's a book on the history of the housing, and, to kind of grasp. And so you did such a phenomenal job of, again, taking this interdisciplinary enterprise, pulling it together in a concise enough way for a person to read and engage on the topic and walk away at the very least with a paradigm that they can go, okay, like, even if you don't agree with it at the end of it, I think that an honest person will recognize there's merit here. Secondly, they'll say, okay, I can't simply dismiss this any longer. This is something, there's a significant enough picture that has been painted that I have to consider it. If you got a callous heart, you can do it. But if you have a softer heart, if you have a heart that's being shaped and developed by the Holy Spirit, I don't see how you can read this book and simply just walk away with an often callous attitude towards social justice and social issues that impact marginalized people that a lot of evangelicals seem to be doing today. And before we get out of here, like I sent you a video recently because I went to this local conference.
Okay, yeah.
I went to this local
I was
conference.
not going to let you hang up without us doing this
because I read it in your book. Go ahead, you take over.
Let me be the interviewer for a second. Let me be the
Go ahead.
Okay, so in the book, in one of the chapters, I introduced the chapter. The chapter is regarding whether or not Christianity is a white man's religion. I introduced it by telling of an experience I had when I was in my early to mid 20s, and I was on a seminary. I happened to be on a seminary campus when this conversation occurred. I will not say the name of the seminary to protect the guilty, but I was having a conversation with a Black seminary student on this campus, and he was the one who argued and did not. This was a shameless thing. Was not trying to unpack any irony here, but he was saying we benefited from slavery, and I said, now explain what you mean by that. He says, if had it not been for slavery, we would not be in America. I've heard stand-up comedians make this joke, okay, but never met a person who did it this sincerely. We would not be in America. We would not be students in these seminaries. We would not be the recipients of these educations. We would not be exposed to this level of thought. He says this didn't occur in Africa because thinking in Africa was so backward. He actually used the word backward. I needed for him. I was young. I needed for him to explain what he meant by the word backward because I didn't have any context for that language. But he actually used the word backward and said that the development of Christianity that occurred in Europe and in North America is the reason we benefited by being brought here and packaged in our ancestors. And my question to him was, are you familiar? And I didn't know the answer to this question at the time. Are you familiar with what Christianity was on the continent of Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade? A millennium prior to the transatlantic slave trade. I wasn't familiar with it, but I knew that there was something to be studied there because I knew that Dr. Evan and William Dwight McKissick, I didn't say this parenthetically, nothing drives me crazy more than finding a typo in a book that just came out. And I noticed that Dr. McKissick's first name is misspelled in that chapter. There's an S on his first name. And that's the kind of thing you don't notice it till you look at it in print. And 24 sets of eyes were on that, and we all missed that. But I knew that I was familiar because I was at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship at the time, and Pastor McKissick and Dr. Evans had a book out entitled Roots 2, If Anyone Asks You Who I Am. And I had not read it. I owned it, but I had not read it. And I knew because of what they did and how deliberate they are, there has to be some merit to an African presence in the Christian world, in the church world. And I asked him, are you even familiar with any of this? And he said, no. And he said it as though he didn't need to be. Seminary gave him all that he needed. And the thing he landed firm on was, we benefited from slavery because of us being here. And that sounded like Stockholm syndrome to me. Just identifying with an oppressor. So Chris, you read that, and you happened to be at a conference when you read that, and you contacted me, and you took the time to shoot a video of whoever was speaking. I don't know the gentleman, but you shot a video of the man who was speaking at the time, and you texted it to me, and he was saying almost verbatim the same thing. He's arguing slavery was bad, but the fruits of it for us were good. Can you please tell me what's going through your mind while that's happening, and how you link that back to what you just read? Let me be the one who asks a question here, because that experience, for me, that experience is 2.5 decades old. For you, it's 2.5 weeks old. So where are you on your assessment on that, of having heard that message in 2023?
Okay, I wasn't surprised. Okay, so I don't know if you know who Samuel Say is. He's kind of like he's this African dude that that's become sort of like a mouthpiece for okay, let me rephrase that. I love Samuel. I really do. Like I have this practice of, when I encounter a person who I disagree with, rather than to go out and just do a video on them, if I'm friends with them on Facebook, I contact them. I just inbox them, like, yo, what's up? I exchange numbers, and I'll talk to them. I'll talk to you on the phone 5-10 times in the background, having conversations, getting a feel and such. And so this happened with Samuel. And so
I've never met him. I'm only familiar with him because of social media. And he and I have had a few moments on social media that I had to land the plane before it got too ugly.
Yeah.
It was that
hey, trust me.
Yeah.
So like, so I'm like, okay, I've had conversations, and he's a civil enough guy where we had some conversations. Has a very lovely wife, brilliant woman. I had some really good conversations with her too at this conference we were at. Anyway, so he's coming to speak at this conference, and I saw the topics at the conference, and I'm like, okay, this is going to be a hot mess, but it's local. It's at a church that I'm familiar with. I had some very similar conversations with the previous pastor of this church. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to go over to this conference, and I'm going to offer some, some critical questions to kind of, salt the oats for people in the audience. I'm like, I've read tactics. So, never attack the man with the mic, but I'm tactful enough to ask a few questions in a way where it's thought provoking. So that's my intent, to go there and do that. But I knew it was going to be a tough environment. I'm sitting there, and it's just speaker after speaker, just saying some of the most misinformed comments. It grieved me so hard that I got up and left out of the main auditorium, because I was like, I just can't. So I'm texting like Matthew and my buddy Brandon Cleaver and a bunch of different people. I'm texting them like, you will not believe the type of stuff people are saying here. It's crazy. I mean, I know you'll believe it, but I'm just like in utter disbelief. And Brandon's like what? Give me an example. And I'm texting him. I literally just hit record on my phone because I had left out and was sitting in the auditorium. So he said, give me a sample. I just hit record because the guy's talking. And I'm like, he's going to say something. Literally, when I hit record, he said that. And I let it go for about 30 seconds and just hit stop and sent it. And like, this is exactly, like, I literally hit record and sent this for you. And this is the type of crazy stuff they're saying this entire thing. And then I was really brave at lunchtime. And at the table that I was at, I asked them, I said, if I said that it's hard for the rich to inherit the kingdom of God, and I said, what do you think Jesus meant when he said it's hard for the rich to inherit the kingdom of God? No one's got any clue, or no comments at all. I said, I feel like if someone said that today, they would be accused of being a CRTist, or they would accused to be, capitalist. They would have all type of accusations. I feel like every speaker would condemn that. Yet Jesus himself said that. Mm-hmm. Then I said, well, or what do you think James meant when he said that have not God chosen the poor of this world to inherit the kingdom of God in James chapter 2? I said, what do you think it meant? I said, once again, like, I don't understand how these speakers are up here on stage saying the things that they're saying, where I can reference 10, 20 passages in the New Testament alone, so they can't dismiss it as Old Testament, where they're saying things that undermine Scripture, undermine Scripture. So anyway, it was an experience, that's for sure. I don't think I made much headway. Maybe maybe after the fact, no one seemed to be showing any signs of thinking more critically in the moment. I mean, there was literally one guy went on talking for 20 minutes after I made the two observations about Jesus and James. He went on for 20 seconds, and another woman went on like black people are lazy and causing all their own problems. And I just shut up and just let it go from there.
Now here's why that's important to me. That us having that conversation. If you read the introduction in A Burning House, I actually mention his last name escapes right now. His first name is Abraham. He's a black intellectual, black public intellectual, who wrote a book entitled The American Negro. He was very critical, probably more critical of black people than his white counterparts would have been. And I use him as an example. And I also use the black seminary student as a later example, a few chapters later. I did that because my observation has been that my biggest hurdle in having these conversations with people and explaining that we're not crazy is that they can cite a minority of black people who affirm those ideas. A minority of them. So I'm not dealing with my white friends who are evangelical. I'm dealing with, and I can probably be accurate when I say this, I'm dealing with 7 public intellectuals and what I would call pseudo intellectuals. Some of them are not that sharp, but 7 public intellectuals who are specialists. Now I have 2 problems with that. Number one, none of them are theologians. They're not appealing to theologians. None of them are. They're not appealing to historians. Okay, they have PhDs. All except for one of them has a PhD. And
Matthew,
and because you have a PhD, you end up becoming omniscient. So you just because you study, I'm going to give my hand here, but this is me dancing close to the edge. But just because you have a PhD in economics does not make you a good theologian. It does not make you a good philosopher. It does not make you a good a sociologist. And so you become an expert on all things, and you're the go-to reference point. You're the one that they can cite as their source. And the reason I want to point that out is just because a person has melanin in their skin doesn't mean that they cannot have bad ideas around this discussion.
I make this point, just as a just as part of my cumulative case. I say, listen, Thomas Sowell, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King were all contemporaries. Think about that.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Thomas Sowell were all contemporary. They were born within 5 years of one another. 2 of them were murdered. One of them is still alive, writing books, saying all type of crazy stuff. And the one who's still alive talking sound like the people that was oppressing our ancestors.
See,
So
let me
figure that out.
Let me be more covert with mine. See, here's the thing. He's from Detroit. I'm telling you, whenever it's Detroit and Chicago, subtlety is not on the list of things to do. Okay, so the way I do it is one of those people that they appeal to on a regular basis, and he is a part of the American evangelical community. He's a fundamentalist. He talks greasy about Martin Luther King. Continue everything Martin Luther King ever did. Okay, three degrees. He has 3 degrees, and all of them are from Southern Baptist schools. And Martin Luther King could not enroll at any of those 3 schools. You were able to enroll at these 3 schools because of the heavy lifting he did to get you here. And then you standing on his shoulders, you accomplish the things that you accomplished, and you turn back and you talk greasy about him and call him a socialist and a neo-Marxist, and he's everything except the child of God. when you stand on his shoulders right now. It is possible. I'm not confronting ethnicity right now. I'm confronting racialized notions, bad racialized ideas, and I don't care who says them. I don't care who writes these ideas. It's a poor representation of what occurred historically, and because of that, it's a poor interpretation of the present. And if we do not have a sound historical perspective, a sound understanding of the present, and a theological filter, a theological grid through which we're going to pass all these things and get to an ethical response to the circumstances, we will be in the condition we're in right now for the foreseeable future. I had a conversation just yesterday, and someone says, "What is the biggest theological problem the church is going to have to address in the next phase?" And this was a survey that was done on social media, and everyone was saying things like, the biggest problem is the inerrancy of Scripture, or the deity of Christ. And I said, you're answering this question like it's 1984. Okay, that it was old hat in 1984. The present problem is the same one we've always had, and it's the one we're going to have for the foreseeable future. It is theological anthropology. Until we have a good theology of humanity and honor the value of the human beings we're talking about, and consider the implications of what a human being endured historically, which turned them into the person they are now, which turned a community into the community that it is now. Until we do that well, we're going to be off mission as a Christian movement. And because of that, because we've done that historically, American evangelicalism is in decline. Meanwhile, it is thriving in the global South. If you go to Latin America, if you go to Africa, it is thriving. Why? Because they have a communal perspective of their faith. They have a higher appreciation, a higher regard for supernatural things, because they were not stricken by modernity in the way that America and Europe were. And in addition to that, they have a higher regard for a community of people. One individual is a part of a whole. When you are injured, when you endure injustice, the whole community is injured. The whole community is in the midst of injustice. Until we turn on that, we will experience the yawning chasm that exists within racial divisions in America for the foreseeable future. And we're going to constantly tilt at windmills. We're going to complain about the circumstances instead of using a comprehensive gospel to confront them.
Ooh. Hey, let me crack my quick joke. In completely unrelated news, Voddie Baucham thanked God for slavery also, and because of slavery, he was able to be sent back to the African continent. Just completely unrelated, but I thought that would be valuable too, because he was quoting Thomas Sowell also.
That was such a Detroit thing to do. That was so Detroit. Okay.
That was Chris calls it the gospel of America. What he's now exporting to Zambia.
Exactly. The good news for them is that America exists. That's the good news. It's not that Yahweh or Jesus is bringing flourishing and salvation to whosoever. But that's a whole nother conversation.
All right, we're about to wrap it up, but there is one question, and I think it's a good question. If you don't, do you want one question, Pastor?
There was 2 or 3 questions. I saw some.
I'll take what you have. I'll take what you got.
Okay, all right. We'll make this quick because I want people to actually watch it, and I know how the attention span can get a little bit.
Yeah.
So, all right, here it is. Is America able to turn this ship around?
I would argue. Okay, let me be. I wish my wife could co-sign this real quick. I am by nature a pessimist. I'm a cynic, shamelessly. Okay, in everything I'm that way, except when it comes to the gospel. I believe that the gospel is the one place where cynicism is sin. So the thing that has to happen here is we have to adopt, because the church in America has two primary problems. I spent a whole lot of pages to unpack two issues. We have a truncated gospel, and we have a poor understanding of the mission field where that gospel should be applied. A diminished gospel and a poor understanding of the place where we need to apply the gospel. So the first thing we need to do is embrace a whole gospel. Move beyond the truncated, reductionistic view that we have right now, where we've demoted the gospel to the doctrine of justification, and embrace a comprehensive view of what Christ has done, a kingdom gospel, or to use the language of I just drew a blank on his name. I got sleepy. King Jesus Gospel. What's
Scott
his name?
McKnight.
McKnight, goodness.
Yeah.
To use the language of Scott McKnight, an apostolic gospel. Okay, an apostolic gospel where it's not just one that's mindful of justification, but it's one that's mindful of the brokenness that is common to a fallen world. We have to have a whole gospel, one that sees that Jesus did not merely resurrect, but that he ascended and is seated on a throne right now. But the other thing we have to do is we have to be able to see the mission field where that gospel will be applied. We have to see that mission field well. And I think you have to integrate the church, globally integrate the church, so you can see it well. Because while I have not had, you mentioned earlier that one of the things we discussed in the book is how much experience will shape what you see. The experience doesn't have to be yours. You can inherit someone else's experience. Someone else's experience can shape your understanding of a moment. It can shape your interpretation of an event. I mentioned an experience I had with Mother Kelsey, where I will never understand the Birmingham campaign the same way. She was there, and she told me the story, and I've inherited her experience, which then shapes how I see it. If we globally integrate the church, then the American church can benefit from the observation of evangelical movements, Christian movements in the global South, and they have a much more emphatic appreciation for justice and for communal wholeness. It's the reason the liberation movement was so strong in the I actually have that book. That's one of the driving forces behind it. Okay, it's the reason the liberation movement was so strong in Latin America. Is because they're coming from a context that understands that as a value and the gospel's relevance to that value. So if we adopt a comprehensive gospel and then get a more comprehensive perspective on the mission field, the world, by integrating it so we can see it the way other people see it, I think there's hope. That's one of the reasons I wanted to very carefully give examples of people who I think did this well. Vernon C. Grounds did this well. Carl F.H. Henry did this well. Okay, I think that Richard Allen. We often attend to an oversimplification of what the AME Church was. The AME Church was the civil rights movement before there was a civil rights movement. Okay, the civil rights movement of the 20th century came out of the church. The prototype, the precursor to that was in the 19th century when the AME Church became that place of community. I think that they did that well. If we adopt a Trinitarian theology and a gospel that is mindful of the fallen world, and we integrate it so we can integrate well and be a community, we will make an impact for the kingdom. And because of that, I think there's hope. The problem is repentance is the last thing someone wants to do when they are in the privileged position. Instead of repenting, we're fighting to keep the privilege. Because what I just described requires that we sit at the feet of African theologians, of Latin American theologians, of Asian theologians. And that's not something that the American church wants to do, because we consider ourselves the cream of the Christian crop. So sitting at someone else's feet would be humiliating. And I'm saying we have to humble ourselves at someone else's feet.
Man. So I'm going to ask one more question. What could you explain your view of the Trinity? Because like I said, that's a pretty important piece of your book for the philosophy nerds and nerds who are in ethics. Go ahead and explain that just a little bit.
Okay, so I see another question here too from Nick on the Trinity. That's y'all gonna have me here all night because the Trinity is something we can talk about for a while. So I'm sorry on John Wesley, but my understanding of the Trinity.
You can tackle both of those quickly if you want to, if you can.
Yeah, I can do the John Wesley one in a nutshell. I'm a fan of John Wesley. Do I disagree with John Wesley on some secondary theological matters? Yes, I am shamelessly reformed in my theology.
No, I'm just kidding.
So in some respects, John Wesley and I disagree, but John Wesley was one of the voices of a whole gospel. He was one of the voices of a comprehensive message that's mindful not just of eternal destiny, but mindful of the circumstances in which a person finds themselves here on earth. It is not an accident that Wesleyan Methodists would purchase enslaved people for the sake of buying their freedom. That was a value of this. Did they always execute it well? No, but that's where they deviated from the teachings of their founder. So I'm a fan of John Wesley, a big fan. Regarding the Trinity, I have what I would call a more Eastern Orthodox view of the Trinity. So some of you may be familiar with that graphic of the Trinity where you have the center, that circle in the center. I wish I could put it up on the screen right now. That circle in the center that says God, and then you have Father, Son, Spirit, and the arrows pointing at them say the Son is not the Father is not the Son, the Spirit is not the Son, that kind of thing. But they're all God. The problem with that is it treats them as distinct from one another while defining their characteristics. It defines each of them as characteristically deity, characteristically God, but it doesn't get into their relationship. And if you read the Nicene Creed, one thing that comes forth in that is that they not only mention God the Father as a loving deity to whom we have access, but when they get to the discussion regarding the Son, they say of the Son that he is eternally begotten, that they treat the Father as the fount, and the Son is the eternally begotten one. That means there's never been a time that the Son did not exist, but he eternally comes from the Father. And then the Spirit eternally proceeds from them both. The way the Spirit does that is more mysterious, I think. But the Spirit of God eternally proceeds from them both. And it speaks to their relationship. I think there's something to be said about how Augustine handles this. The Father loves the Son eternally. There we go. I do not like that graphic. I do not, because it's so emphatic regarding what each of them is, but that it doesn't do a good job of going into is and is not, by the way. But it doesn't get into the discussion regarding what they are to one another and the nature of their relationship. The Father, Son, and the Spirit is a community of three. It's a social, we worship a social Trinity. Our God is a social Trinity that has never known broken fellowship or disharmony. And each of them is mindful of the other, sacrificial even, if necessary, for the other. They have this depth of fervor for one another. A human society is to reproduce on a human level what that Trinitarian community is. So the idea of us being individualistic is not Trinitarian. The idea of us pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps is not Trinitarian, because if the Son needed to pull himself up, the Spirit of God would not sit idly by and say, get up. This is a broken situation because they're all God. Anyone that can get up whenever they will. But the Spirit of God would not sit by and say, get up on your own. Do this of your own. That's not how it works. They are not that type of disconnected. We've disconnected ourselves when we've been called to look like the society that our God is. And because of that, I cannot see one of you in need, a need that I can meet, and then chastise you for getting yourself into that situation and never go about fulfilling the need according to my provision, according to my ability.
Last question, Pastor B. This is from Shawnee. When the podcast coming?
I don't need to do a podcast. We have Apologist in Detroit. We have MJ. We have True ID. We have people putting in We have people putting in work. Pastor McElroy's on here putting in work. I don't need me.
Oh man, you better stop.
Shawnee trying to start something. That's what that is. They both know that they have. So I'm getting teamed up on Shawnee and Michelle and my wife. They are that community of three who have circled me and asked me questions like that to move me forward. And my response to them is, I have people who are holding that down. I pastor a church in Denver. My goal is to love on them well, and occasionally write my rantings down and publish those. And I talk enough. I want to listen to people more.
I got you. Well, look.
Hey, say just tell them, hey, I drop a new podcast every Sunday.
There you go.
Let me tell you like this, Pastor B, because I've been wanting to get you on this channel. One of my favorite episodes of listening to you was when you and Brother Vader was dropping bars on his channel.
Oh, and you've been listening. That was a few years ago. Okay.
That was quite a few years. I've listened to that several times. I used to work on assembly lines. That's all I had to do to keep me sane.
Okay.
So my platform is always open to you. Okay. I will not engage in controversial topics when you come on here because I'm crazy like that. I'm from West Fort Worth. But look, I just want to tell you that we appreciate you and your marketing president, because in order for you to write a book like this, your wife had to hold it down and she had to support you. And I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. Sometimes I get burnt out talking about this topic and it gets a little weird. I can only imagine everything that you went through having to write a book, to do the research for it. And so I just want to give First Lady First Lady Washington a shout out. Your marketing president on those marketing skills. Bars. That's H-Town in the building.
Okay.
So I just want to give her a shout out and just let you know how much we appreciate this book. And this cover is fly.
Yeah.
So y'all know I like black. Yeah. So everybody, please go get this book. Let's start some book clubs. And so before we close it out, I'm going to go to Apologist in Detroit, then I'm going to give you the last word, Pastor B.
All right, appreciate it.
Hey, man, I'm just happy to, I'm getting over this, whatever it is that I had, and I'm getting my voice back. And yeah, it was a great read. It was a pleasure to actually meet you in person. Before you get off behind scenes, I got a question for you.
Okay.
And otherwise, yeah, it was, hey, everybody, miss y'all. Happy to get back. I'm going to get on Matthew so that we can start producing once a month like we supposed to be.
All right. The couple of things I wanted to, I'm glad you did that too, Matthew. I do want to give my wife a shout out because she everyone knows what her role she's played over the last 8, 9, 10 days because she did that 7-day countdown. And by the way, I would get those updates along with everyone else. So when she started the first one 7 whole days, and Shawnee and Michelle kind of egged her on, I said, y'all don't want to do that because it's gonna get crazy. And when she did the Aaliyah remix with the hair over her eye, I said, this is the woman I know. This is the woman I married. But the bigger thing that she did along the way was there were some long days. There were days of me coming home at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night after having to do whatever reading was necessary so that could be written. And she held the homestead down. And I always want to very publicly acknowledge the role that she played in that process. This is a work of ours because I could not have been available to do that had she not been so deliberate. I also want to give a shout out to Shawnee and Michelle because they are marketing and organizing extraordinaires, and they're a 1-2 punch too. They feed off of one another. So the organizing of the launch team and getting everybody ready for that and giving everyone templates of what to do, and I could not have accomplished that without them. And as of I don't know what it is right now because I don't like checking it because I do better when I promote from a lead position, but it was number one in the Christian ethics as of the time we started this podcast. That would not be true if it were not for my wife Cherie, for Shawnee and Michelle. So I want to publicly acknowledge them putting their hands to the plow and getting this done. But the bigger thing for me is, and I'm not supposed to say this, but it's more important to me that people read it than for it to be a number one seller. I hope it is a number one seller, but I didn't write it for that. It's more important for me for people to read it because I want it to be a ministry to them. Because I got to tell you something along the way. Just how much I identify with the people I'm appealing to. I had to stop sometimes and take care of my own mental health, because there were times when reading the stuff necessary to write this devastated me, especially because I have people who I've long considered my friends, co-laborers in the faith, who mock much of what I'm dealing with while I'm writing this book. Sometimes unwittingly and sometimes outright. Sometimes they're glib and sometimes they're dismissive. There were times when I had to stop and sit down with someone who was good for my mental health. I know that struggle exists, and I want you to hear me say that I dealt with that while writing it, and I wrote it in an effort to minister to those for whom that's a reality and a struggle.
Well, once again, A Burning House. I saw somebody bought it from Uncle Bobby's. That's Mark Lamont Hill's bookstore. So it's everywhere. Please go get that book. Please read it. We want you to read it and pray, and even if you're a person who disagrees, my prayer is that, you would read it and keep an open mind. So with that being said, Pastor Brandon Washington, I'm going to have you come back on because there's another book coming out next month.
I'll be back.
These books are coming out along with the good movies.
Yeah.
So there's another book, and that book, that chapter. Yeah. Oh yeah, that's fireworks. So we got to talk about that one. Got to, yes, sir. But until then, Matthew Jackson, Apologist in Detroit, and Pastor Brandon Washington of Dallas, Texas.
Yeah.
Bringing you A Burning House. We love y'all. Please go get that book. Get that book. Peace.
Peace.